I began work on this, as I said, in 1987 when I was deputy head at Claydon High School, and we celebrated 50 years of the school's existence. And so I was sent off down to the record office to start digging out whatever I could find about the beginnings of the school in 1937. I'd been called an area school. And it was while I was there that I met for the first time Peter Northeast, who very kindly said to me, "You might find this useful." After, well, the second time I met him, he said, "You might actually find this useful." And he gave me a copy of the document which forms the basis of the talk. So here we are, an experiment in rural reorganisation. Well, let's have a look and see what, there we are. It's a Board of Education pamphlet number 93, published in 1933. And here on the right-hand side, you can see the a summary of the content in the introduction. This pamphlet gives an account of the scheme which is being carried out by the East Suffolk Local Education Authority for the reorganisation of their schools for older children along the lines of the report on the education of the adolescent. It appeared to the board that many features of the scheme were likely to be of general interest, and they therefore decided to publish this account of it. Well, okay, so we need to ask a few questions about this. Two key questions, really. Why was East Suffolk, along with other LEAs throughout the county, reorganising its school provision for older children? And in this case, older children meant children of the age of 11 and over. And what recommendations for organising this education appeared in this report on the education of the adolescent? So let's try and come up with some solutions to this. Well, first of all, this map is rather crowded. I'm sorry, it was the best one I could find. Local government in East Suffolk was reorganised in 1888, and the counties of West Suffolk, with 117,553 people in it in 1901, was created, and the county of East Suffolk, as you can see, look much bigger, 255,800, and you can see the heavy dividing line down the middle of the county, leaving Stowmarket in the east, coming through here and all the way down. So you had a county borough, that's Bury St Edmunds. You've got the county. You've got the borough of Eye. You've got the borough of Lowestoft, and of course there is Ipswich, a county borough, a separate organiser, a separate authority, with 66,000. And then in 1902, the Education Act of that year created some new. It abolished all the old Victorian board schools that had been operating since 1870 and created new local education authorities. And in Suffolk, West Suffolk became an LEA in 1902. East Suffolk became an authority, and so did Ipswich. And Lowestoft was partly an authority. It wasn't completely independent. It had control of its elementary schools, but nothing beyond. So that's the educational setup. Now, if we now focus in on East Suffolk and have a look at what was going on there, this chart shows you, this table shows you the number of children in pupils in East Suffolk schools in 1924. From 1920 to 24. You can see the total number of, we're looking at pupils over the age of 11, because these are the pupils that we're going to be focused on in this reorganisation, running around 9,000, a little over 9,000. And of those 9,000, about 1,500 were in secondary schools, what we today would call grammar schools. In the percentage of children involved, about 16% of all over 11s, only 16% were going to a proper secondary school. And there were, here we've got the number in elementary, higher tops or special classes, 83.2, 80 up to 84. So over 80% in East Suffolk were still in their elementary school, or attending an elementary school where a few of them have been collected into what they called a higher top, a group for older children. Not a very satisfactory situation. Now, to give you an idea of the difference, here's a picture of an elementary school. It's Eye National School, taken in the early 1920s. If you take a look, there's the headmaster and there is his assistant, and you've got two classes operating in the same large room. Now, if you consider the technical difficulties, the operational problems of getting separate courses of study of interest for pupils between 11 and 14, you can understand how impossible that was to achieve in a school of that type. And by comparison, picture of Eye Grammar School's domestic economy room, and you've got less than a dozen pupils in there. So clearly, numbers make a difference, teacher-pupil ratios make a difference, and East Suffolk was beginning to look at ways of reorganising the educational experience for children over the age of 11. The official leaving age before the First World War, was they could not be kept at school beyond the age of 13, but they could leave at any time up to the age of 13 once they'd suitably passed the tests imposed by the LEA and had gained their labour certificate. Now, this is to define the two. I've talked about secondary or grammar, I've talked about elementary. I think we need to define these and understand exactly what it is that we're talking about. The elementary education was that provided free at the point of use by the state in either voluntary church schools or council LEA schools for pupils from 5 to 13, and that's up to 1921, and up to age 14 by Fisher's Act of 1918. But notice, the Act did not come into force straight away. It was passed in 1918. They didn't implement it until February 1922 because they hadn't got the funds. Secondary education was that paid for by middle-class parents in private schools, for example, Framlingham College or Ipswich School. It might have been part funded by the state. There were schools part funded by the state, like fee-charging secondary schools such as Stowmarket Secondary School or Eye Grammar School, which had been taken over by the LEA at that point. So you can see there's quite a difference in approach and attitude and understanding of what these different kinds of education were about. From 1907, 25% of places in the state secondary schools were provided free and awarded by competitive examination. And that, I think, is the origin of the later 11 plus exam, which stayed with us for a long time and in some parts of the country is still with us. Now, people were not happy with this. They different bodies thought it was an unfair system and called for change. There were deputations from the Independent Labour Party and the Trade Union Congress to the Board of Education, that was the governing body of the system. Today it's the Department of Education, Science and what else. Then it was the Board of Education. And resolutions between 1909 and 1914 demanding the abolition of secondary school fees altogether. You see, if you didn't pass the scholarship exam, you had to pay to go to a secondary school. And speakers said, well, head teachers are often quite hostile to free placeholders. They look down on them. And also candidates whose parents can afford the coaching for the examination by secondary school teachers, they can get in more easily. And they said fees were being imposed not really to provide revenue, but to keep the secondary school exclusive. And the war happened, and the effects of wartime conditions between 1914 and 1918 led to calls for widespread post-war social improvement, including a much better education system. And here is the man that started it all off, Herbert Fisher. And he was a historian. He was Vice Chancellor of Sheffield University and President of the Board of Education in 1917. And he piloted through his Education Act of 1918 to raise the leaving age to 14, and also to provide part-time 14 to 16-year-olds not in any other form of full-time education. It really was part-time. It was planned that each child would receive 320 hours a year, which isn't an awful lot of education when you think about it. So that was the scheme. And as I said, even that was not immediately implemented. Now, he said the war was my opportunity to change people's minds and try and bring in something better. Now, here was the scheme. In response to the Act, East Suffolk got on with the business of drawing up a plan to implement Fisher's Act. And here's the scheme that they did. You can see that if I move my, I've lost my cursor for a minute. Here we are. There's all the massive children in the public elementary schools, and there are a few private elementary schools, and you can see they both feed the public secondary schools. Now, these children would either go to these day continuation schools, or if they haven't got a job, or they will go to central schools and classes that they would be offering a technical or commercial kind of education. Well, it was an attempt to start to improve things, but of course it was doomed to failure because there was no money. It was suspended in 1921 anyway, and so the plan was never put into practice. However, East Suffolk continued the policy of trying to save money and trying to create these higher tops, trying to concentrate the older pupils into smaller groups in selected schools. And by 1932, 24 schools catering for pupils between 5 and 14 had been closed. 56 had been reduced to the status of junior schools, with the senior pupils transferred away to other schools, and 16 other rearrangements had been done. Where the economies in teaching staff had been affected. East Suffolk also had to cope with the problem of youth unemployment, because there was a serious, as you know, there was a serious economic downturn after World War I, and in particular agriculture was hit with the ending of subsidies, and so when about up to 90% of boys leaving elementary school went into farming, you can understand that youth unemployment was a serious problem. So East Suffolk was grappling with the problem of youth unemployment, the need to try and save money by reducing the number of pupils in the smaller schools and concentrating them. And it came up with a scheme to help it do this, and it applied to the Board of Education for permission to increase the leaving age to 15 using a bylaw, which it was permitted to do under the 1918 and the 1921 Acts. Now, they didn't immediately get any joy from this. They were questioned a great deal by the board about this. The board wasn't absolutely sure about it. They kept trying. They were turned down to begin with. They kept trying, and eventually they succeeded in October 1924. And the reason they did was because this man had become the president of the Board of Education in Ramsay MacDonald's first Labour government, Sir Charles Trevelyan. He was in fact a nephew of the great Lord Macaulay. And he was very much in favour of what was going on, but he was very keen that they were not just going to use the schools as a means of coping with youth unemployment. He said, we rigorously set up, this is in Parliament, we rigorously set our teeth against a practice of regarding the schools as a sort of waiting room for employment. Well, that was a bit unfair about East Suffolk, because it wasn't really doing that. They were really trying hard to set up their special subject centres and get some better curriculum going for the older pupils. And really, if it was going to make real progress and stay on side with the board, East Suffolk had got to prove that a rural authority could overcome the handicaps it faced in moving towards a general leaving age of 15. They were fortunate in the sense that at the time they were doing this, concern on a national level was growing at the problem of youth unemployment and the fact that clearly older children between over the age of 11 needed something better than was being provided. And the person who was involved in doing something about this was Sir William Henry Haddo. He was Vice Chancellor of the University of Sheffield. He was noted for his scholarly graduate, lecturer, fellow, tutor and dean of Worcester College, Oxford. He had a reputation as a brilliant lecturer, scholar and administrator, and the other members of his committee included a very large number of educational professionals and administrators. And his report, which came out in 1926, was the report referred to in the board's pamphlet number 93, The Education of the Adolescent. Well, while they were happening, other people have been making calls for change, and one of these was this academic, Richard Henry Tawney, and he produced a pamphlet in 1922 for the Labour Party called Secondary Education for All. And Tawney's idea was that in this booklet it set out Labour education policy, and it called for an approach whereby secondary education would become a stage following primary education, and he said, to which all normal children, irrespective of the income, class or occupation of their parents, may be transferred at the age of 11 plus from the primary or preparatory school to one type or another of secondary school and remain at the latter until they are 16. Now, Tawney's presence on the Haddo Committee have led historians to believe that the Haddo Committee would then go on to debate how to organise this new form of secondary education. Well, let's have a look at this committee. There were 20 members, drawn mainly from the branches of the educational establishment, including Tawney. The terms of reference that it set for itself, it was a very powerful committee. It could decide what it wanted to debate and how it wanted to advise the department. And its original terms of reference were the different types of curriculum suitable to children between the ages of 11 and 16, and the means by which these can be provided. However, it had a meeting with the permanent secretary of the board, Sir Amos Selby Bigg, between October and December 1923. There were several meetings and conferences with him, and after discussion with Selby Bigg, they changed it to consider and report upon the organisation, objectives and curriculum of courses of study suitable for children who will remain in full-time attendance at schools other than secondary schools. That's not quite what they thought they were going to do. But they accepted this and got on with the job, probably believing that it wasn't so different. The Haddo Committee eventually in 1926, as I said. Well, what about opportunity for secondary education in the 1920s? It was pretty limited. Only about 9.5% of children leaving elementary school each year went on to secondary schools. And of these, only about a third were from working class families. That's from a book called Social Progress and Educational Waste by Kenneth Lindsay. Now, the term secondary school, as I said, had long been applied to both the ancient grammar schools founded in the medieval, Tudor and Stuart periods, and the many fee-charging state schools of a similar type founded after the 1902 Education Act by the new LEAs. Parents were expected to keep their children attending them till at least the age of 16. And it was this standard of education, but without fees, and with wide forward pathways, was what Tawney and like-minded educators were demanding for all children. Now, of course, Selby Bigg represented the opinion strongly in Baldwin's first government and across the country at the time that regarded secondary education not as a stage, but as a separate system, as I said, for training a professional and business elite, while the working class went to elementary schools and into manual jobs. All nice and tidy, beautifully organised, no need to change it. Well, the Haddo Committee came up with some quite interesting recommendations, and here they are. It said that primary education should end at 11 plus, that all normal children, we'll talk about that later in a minute or two, all normal children should go on to some form of secondary education. It should be in non-selective schools, where the bias would be towards practical work, and in these schools the staffing ratios would be at least as good as in the grammar schools, and they hope to raise the leaving age to over 15 to 15 plus by 1932, and there would be some new leaving exams. Wow, sounds pretty good. And the Haddo Committee justified itself in the following way. It says there are diversities. Must be diversity of educational provision. Equality, in short, is not identity, and schools should provide a range of educational opportunities sufficiently wide to appeal to varying interests and cultivate powers which differ widely both in kind and degree. Well, you can't argue with that. People have all got different kinds of talents and skills. So it said, okay, the existing county and municipal secondary schools would be renamed grammar schools, because that linked to it linked newer developments to what they called an ancient and dignified tradition for culture. And the new schools would be called modern schools, to offer a prominent place to studies whose bearing on practical life would be obvious and immediate. And as they said, the question is that you see, they didn't want to bring in something completely. British don't do reform by bringing in something completely different. They look at what's gone before and tweak it. The question is not one of erecting a structure on a novel and untried pattern, but of following to their logical conclusions precedents already set, and of building on foundations which have long been laid. So it says, the initiative of enlightened educational authorities, well, that's East Suffolk, and the progress of educational science have revealed both the possibilities of post-primary education and the practical steps. Good. And interestingly, look at the last bit here. On the financial aspects of the question, we do not feel an opinion on the grounds that the financial reactions of educational policy may be overlooked is not perhaps a very pressing danger. So they actually thought they didn't have to worry about the finance, that nothing awkward would happen about that. It would all be sorted out completely. Well, let's see what happened. So, were the new modern schools to have parity of esteem, as they called it, with the newly named but well-established grammar schools? That's what they wanted, but the key test would be their design and funding. Now, in 1938, the Board of Education issued regulations, or updated its regulations, and here we have a comparison. This was evidence submitted to a later committee. Here are the regulations. Remember, I said that there are different regulations for governing secondary schools to regulations governing elementary schools. So what we've got here, if it's a secondary school, the class size maximum should be 30. If it was one of these new schools, which they were calling senior elementary schools, it would be 40. The floor space per pupil in a grammar school would be 16. In one of these new schools would be only 12. There would be specialist rooms. All the sciences had their own labs. In the senior elementary school, a multi-purpose science room. The cost per pupil, £85 to £95 for a secondary school, £40 to £45 for a senior elementary school. And if you took school, if you ran it under secondary regulations, it could only accommodate 495 children. If you ran it under senior elementary regulations, you could get in 810. So there is not parity of provision, and there therefore would not be parity of esteem. This letter appeared sometime later in the 1950s, but I think it helps to make the point. It was from a headmaster of what they called a bilateral school. The fiction of equal opportunity for pupils in secondary and modern schools is accepted as truth by many people. The following conditions exist under the educational authority which I serve. Staff ratios less generous. Per capita allowance for books is less than half of those in grammar schools. Per capita allowance for games in modern schools are half those in grammar schools. And as one researcher into the Haddo Committee, Jennifer Firmager, remarked, this unhappy situation resulted in part from the Haddo Committee's acceptance of the argument that the modern school child was different from the grammar school child. Now, that's not the same thing as saying we all have different talents. That's saying they're fundamentally different children. And it also resulted in financial arrangements arising from the classification of the new schools as elementary. Yes, indeed, as we've just seen. Well, why did they think they were different, and how did they go about deciding which was which? This is the man that put it all together, Dr. Cyril Burt. the Professor of Psychology at University College London, 1931 to 1950. He reckoned that everybody's innate intelligence by objective scientific tests, and these would show that 24% of the pupils would be what he called supernormal, and 24% would be subnormal, and the rest, the 52% remaining, he called variously normal, average, or mediocre. And of course, this system was very much in tune with the prevailing ideas of eugenics, where you want to improve the race by selective breeding and screening out of weaker or undesirable elements. So in other words, you need to nurture your successful society. Hang on. What were the implications of organising a school with these categories that Burt? Thus, from quite early years, a child's intelligence roughly marks him out as fit for callings of a certain grade. That's an interesting idea. Large classes and collective methods of teaching, however inadequate, are least unsuited to the average child. The bright and the dull and backward need far smaller classes, individual attention, and a wider scope to follow their own special lines. Well, yes. Burt proposed that 11 was the best age to transfer on psychological grounds. In other words, by then the supernormal would be so far ahead of their chronological peers that keeping them in the same school would be positively harmful. Many may consider their needs decisive. Also, the age of 11 appears to conform to the social and administrative requirements. In other words, we have a system where 11 is a natural changing point, and we need to focus on the needs, the decisive needs of the supernormal. That's where the resources have to go, and that, of course, is in fact what happened. But that doesn't have to mean, and it didn't mean, that the children who did not get in to therefore going to get a particularly poor experience, as I'm going to try and show. However, I do want to bring this to your attention. This comes from the papers at the Haddo Committee papers in the National Archives, not the report itself. This is evidence submitted to the committee. And one of them, W.C. Fletcher, the Chief Inspector of Secondary Schools, said, well, assuming one were convinced that sufficient pupils wanted to stay on to 15, then one must decide on academic or vocational curriculum. If the new type of school were, as it naturally would be, much cheaper and look to the ordinary parent much the same as a second, might be some trouble, but it might not be very serious, especially if both types of school were controlled and financed by the same authority. So all education given to pupils of 15 plus should be seen as secondary education. Now, that was what the main recommendations of the Haddo Committee were. The division between secondary and elementary regulations after the age of 11 is a false one. So Haddo did not ask for secondary education as it was commonly understood. The committee was diverted to looking at children who were not going to grammar schools. Witnesses urged the protection of grammar schools' tradition and the deception of parents by cheaper schools appearing like grammars. Cyril Burt justified this disparity on plausible psychological grounds. So where does that leave us? Well, I'm going to look at implementing the Haddo report in East Suffolk. First of all, I'm turning to a report by the Secretary of the Education Committee, H.N. Spink, which he prepared in 1929. Now, he said the Haddo proposals called for what he called a new standard of efficiency. And he said there should be a much closer relation of the curriculum of schools to local circumstances and practical needs. There should be a higher standard for building and equipment. And he's comparing what they were going to do with what existed in the little village schools, the little elementary schools that we've been looking at. And like all good administrators, he presented them with a cost-benefit analysis of what he was proposing. And he said, well, there will be costs. We've got the expense of building the new schools will mean a very large capital outlay, which of course would unsettle the members of the council. But he said there are practical benefits. The spending would be financed by loans and government grants, so no need to worry about putting up the rates. And there's concentration of pupils would allow the closure of inefficient small schools. And that would give a saving on salaries over the longer term. Now, as things went on, there were, by 1933, when that pamphlet was written, they had 140 full standard schools, i.e. from 5 to 14, 50 council and 90 voluntary. They got 69 junior schools up to 11. There were 29 area schools of the new senior status as proposed in the Hadder report, and these schools had large playgrounds and even playing fields, specialist rooms for handicraft and domestic science. Larger schools were given a science laboratory described as a large classroom with simple fitments, not the same standard as the grammar schools, but at least they could do some science. But science would be taught in the other practical subjects rooms in the smaller schools. Yes, there would be a temporary increase in salary costs, but eventually it would be cheaper because the larger rooms would allow the classes of 40 seniors and 48 juniors. Notice we've got the pretty large classes, which were considered quite okay at the time. Remember what Bert said, the mediocre don't suffer from having large class teaching. And by 1939, here's a map to show all the area schools in Suffolk that had been opened. Now, why only 16? Well, the answer to that is the plans changed as they implemented the scheme. The original plan was to have 55 area schools, each recruiting from a very close area. By January 1937, they increased the size to a minimum of 160 places per school. And then by October, this went up to 520. So they then realised they only needed 16 schools. And although they didn't like paying for motor transport, we'll come on to that in a minute, they just had to accept the cost eventually, as there was no other solution. But to begin with, they didn't go for motor transport. This is what they did. They went for bicycles. And as the BOE booklet makes out, in Suffolk, the climate is generally dry and the terrain is flat, and so a total ride of 9 miles per day would not make unduly heavy calls upon the strength and vitality of the children. And I've put in a couple of bikes from 1930s adverts to give you an idea of what they would look like. Now, where a cycle was to be used, pupils living up to 4.5 miles would have a county bicycle. If they used their own bike, they would have an allowance of £2 a year, which had £124 today. Or they could have a county bicycle and a cape and leggings, which would be loaned to them. And they were supposed to be returned to the Education Committee, or they could be bought. And they would sell the bikes at £4.12 for a bike, 13 and 6 for a boy's cape, and 11 and 10 for a girl's cape. And I put the modern equivalent figures underneath there. Sorry, I'm pointing with my finger, and that's the one I need to use. And here's an advert for a bike of the period to give you an idea of that cost £8.15 in the shops, and a similar machine, admittedly with not quite such sporty handlebars, but that would have cost about half that if they bought it from the county. So it wasn't actually a very bad '30s picture, but I think it illustrates quite well that the dangers of children cycling in traffic, and this did come up. Children had to make. In one case, in the north of the county, they even agreed that the children would cycle the other way, going to Diss into Norfolk to school, so they didn't have to cross the A140, what today is the A140, the Norwich trunk, the main Norwich road, at a point known locally as the Devil's Hand Basin. It's up near Eye. If you've been up that way, you'll understand that crossing that road there is not very easy. The other thing they were worried about was some parents were worried about boisterous behaviour, the children messing about on their bikes and likely to have an accident. I found this picture of children doing exactly that. And so you can understand why some of the parents might have been a little bit uneasy about this. So with the support of their parish council, the small village of Walpole wrote in and asked that their children should have a bus. And the Education Secretary, Leslie Misson, of the time, replied to the Vicar of Walpole, who was the chairman of one of the schools, that unless a service bus ran at the right time, that was not on. The cost of conveying a comparatively few children by private bus is prohibitive. And he said there were well over 1,000 children travelling to the various area schools on the committee's bicycles, with very few complaints about their conduct on the road. But he would ask the headmaster of Halesworth to have a serious talk with them on the point. This certainly, I know, was very likely to have happened, because at Claydon, this notice was given out in Assembly on the 10th of January 1938. It comes from the Claydon Area School logbook, and you can see it's a list of how to behave on the road and and look after your bike. Make sure the saddle's at the right height, make sure the bell's working, adjust your wheel nuts, dismount when you cross the main road, keep on the left, don't ride two abreast. Very good advice. So they really were trying their best to make it work, and for a time it did. Now look here, this is the plan of Raydon Area School, and I use it to illustrate the enormous changes that were being brought in by East Suffolk. If you look at the plan, there is the actual school building, and these are the grounds, and you've got nobody can, well, it's big enough to see that. You've got fruit trees all along there, more fruit trees, but you've got model vegetable gardens, you've got herbaceous borders, and all these numbers here tell you what's going on. Look, a circular lawn, individual plots with espalier trained fruit trees. It's absolutely beautiful, and the surroundings of each school were planned with the head teacher and the county organiser for gardening, and with local fundraising to supply most of the plants, trees and shrubs. They developed it so that the entrance to their school would, as the Hanna report said, it would be an entrance to a new world, a fair meadow, as they said it. Well, that certainly was what they were aiming for with these schools. And here is the actual school. Now, this is Raydon, what the school that became Raydon Area School. It was a council school open, and if you're looking at the picture, you can see it's not that different from the Victorian elementary schools. It was extended in 1932, and that's when it became an area school, and it became a high school in 1963. It was closed in 1990, and the site converted to housing. But on the internet, the school playing fields are still in use, and the original school canteen building was used for changing rooms. I suspect that picture is probably from before the time that it was extended. Now here's Claydon Area School, more gardens prominently in view. You can see it was prominently in the school curriculum. Just looking at how much time I've got, I think I'm getting close to the end, but I think we'll manage to get it in. Gardening features very prominently in the school curriculum. In some cases, it was linked to the woodwork syllabus, when garden frames and ornamental trellis and supports could be made. Or such integration like this was simply not possible when children were taught in separate special subject centres. And that was one of the things they tried, to take children off to a centre to teach them woodwork or domestic science and then send them back to their elementary school. But it wasn't all that successful. And here we can see boys at work in a school garden. Other crafts, including weaving, pottery, printing and bookbinding, were now being taught. And while such practical activities occupied about half the timetable, integration with maths and English was practiced, leading to more enjoyable lessons. And here you can see another big benefit of the area school system. There's a canteen dinner being enjoyed at an area school. It hasn't got its own dining room. It's all obviously happening in a classroom. You can see that quite clearly in quite well. The area schools had better facilities than in the village schools, also for physical training and games. It was said that these new schools allowed improved concentration in the classroom, particularly for difficult or backward children, and they were generally more confident. One lady visitor visiting an unnamed area school is quoted as saying that the children walked about as if they belonged to a good boarding school. Now, I think this remark would probably have impressed the public schoolmen at the Board of Education, but it certainly is a testament to how well they were doing. But the pamphlet 93 that I took a lot of this from is a very congratulatory document. It did admit that the lack of a hall was inhibiting the area school's role as a social centre for its community. They did say that villagers needed a place suitable for dances, music, choral practice, lectures, and the reception of wireless broadcasting. And this deficiency was all the more regrettable in view of the current concerns about rural depopulation. So it looks as though East Suffolk embarked on it did embark on a thorough scheme of complete reorganisation and brought in many new opportunities. How did this compare with neighbouring authorities? This is Impton Village College in neighbouring Cambridgeshire, and the man responsible for this was its education officer, Henry Morris. It's instructive to make a brief comparison here. He was very similar in his ideas to East Suffolk. He pioneered the idea of what he called the village college. He made much of the need for a practical curriculum for rural children. He wanted it to be a community centre for the village in the evenings. He said it needed a properly stocked library. Interestingly, his schools operated under both elementary and secondary regulations, so they could take children to a greater age eventually. And the leadership of the college was be by a warden, not a head teacher. A slight difference of nomenclature there. And only the best architecture would be used. In fact, for Impton Village College, he had the assistance of Walter Gropius, no less, from the Bauhaus. And the cost, Morris himself raised $47,000 from American and Australian backers. He got a government grant of $39,000, and the county council put in $37,000. And altogether, they got together $124,000 for the first village college at Sawston. So you can see this was quite a big undertaking. The right one. Now, if we go, here's a picture of the Framlingham area school. It looks pretty good. I mean, you can still see parts of it. It's Thomas Mills High School at the present time, and there's the dignitaries at the opening of Framlingham area school. Well, no suggestion was ever made that the area schools would operate under secondary regulations and take scholars to 16. And the buildings were much cheaper. I mean, Felixstowe cost $42,000 and I only cost $11,000. So now I'm not suggesting that the idealism and a commitment to providing a much better education for thousands of children was absent from East Suffolk. It had its roots in earlier cost-cutting measures, but it did evolve markedly as each new phase came on stream. Now here you can see what I mean. Here is the Beccles area school, and this was very much bigger than any of the others. It opened in 1939. It had a site of 15 acres. It had ornamental and vegetable gardens. It was a 2-story brick building. Its hall was equipped with gymnastics and drama. It had a science room, a light craft room, 2 domestic science rooms, a library, medical inspection, kitchen, proper changing and showering facilities, and big spacious playing fields. And its programme notes for the opening state the authorities' intention that The school shall be used as an educational centre for adults as well as for day school purposes, and it has been designed and equipped with this end in view. And I think this school more closely to the village college philosophy of neighbouring Cambridgeshire. They were actually beginning to get there when the war intervened. Just to add a little bit more detail, there's back to Claydon. I did a small local history, oral history project. I interviewed a few former pupils from Claydon area school, and they told me, they were all interviewed separately, that the school's curriculum was basic with handicraft, domestic science and gardening, and the practical subjects recommended at the time. And although the emphasis of each pupil, ex-pupil varied, I managed to tease out some common ground. And the good things they said about it included, it was good to be taught in a class of similar age with appropriate methods, both in sets and mixed ability groups. They were happy that they were given modern equipment to use, such as sewing machines, cookers and lathes. They liked the fact that they had evening classes, dances and drama productions. They said the cookery, and so were the baby care classes. They said staying on to 15 and then succeeding in a written test for a clerical job, that happened to one person. He was really good school accommodation, including flushing toilets and central heating and appetising school dinners. So they were very pleased with what they experienced in the area school. On the weaker side, they said, well, they did have pretty basic science. The specialist teachers were only available for science and practical subjects. Any late transfers to the grammar school, even though the Haddo committee had actually recommended them, and all of them felt the need, were under pressure to leave at 14. So really, you could argue that the prevailing low expectations of families, and I thought of that because one person's mum placed her in service at 14, whether she wanted to be there or not, and the father of another refused to allow her to take up a scholarship to a grammar school, said she didn't need it. These were very powerful factors in limiting opportunity, and the area school was all too often unable to mitigate them. Even so, it did provide a very much better educational experience for its pupils. Now there is a bit of a composite slide. You've got the quadrangle of I area design, and there, by comparison, you've got the staff and senior girls at Mills Grammar School in 1904 and 1933. That's the sixth form. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And there you have beekeeping at I Grammar School. Now, I put that on because we need to compare. The area school, in conclusion, was not therefore, the area school was therefore not an alternative type of secondary school, being rooted firmly in elementary regulations and provision, but it did offer a more varied, more interesting and more up-to-date education than was possible in the all-age village school. The Secretary to the Education Committee, Martin Wilson, wrote a memorandum on the school, on the area school in 1936, in which he saw it as a successful contrast to the weaker secondary schools. He was thinking in particular of I Grammar School, which had been up for closure for more than a decade by this time because it was so uneconomic and inefficient. He saw that the area school had great potential for further development. If area schools with capable heads and suitable teachers developed what he said, an academic side, they could satisfy all the post-11 educational needs of their catchments. These could then be wider than children could cycle through, but with motor transport, distance would no longer be an obstacle. Then the small, uneconomic and generally weak secondary schools with small sixth forms could be closed and replaced by fewer higher schools. Well, he was referring to the present day concept of the comprehensive school, which has now provided for Suffolk and elsewhere the solutions he suggested in 1936. Unfortunately for East Suffolk, he left for Shropshire soon afterwards. And of course, we got the Butler Act of 1944, which imposed the tripartite system. And so the idea did not proceed further for several decades. And just to finish, I'd like to show this in a book I have called A Jubilee of County Councils, published in 1939. This is the national education system as it was by 1939. Start in nursery schools up to 5, go to an infant school from 5 to 7, go to junior schools from 7 plus to 11 primary education. Look, you've got state secondary schools, i.e. grammar schools, which of course are selective. You've got what they call selective senior or central schools. This is where you could do commercial courses or technical courses. East Suffolk didn't have any of those, couldn't afford them. Or you had non-selective senior schools, which of course were, after 1944, were renamed secondary modern schools. And can't quite see the print down there, but it is of great interest to me what they said about the non-selective senior schools. All other children proceed to non-selective senior schools or departments at the age of 11 after the cream has been skimmed by the secondary or selective senior schools. I think the area schools of Suffolk did their best to counteract that attitude that only the cream were worth bothering with. I think they tried their very best with the resources they had to provide the kids that went to them with a much better education than they would have got without that scheme in progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. A subject dear to my heart. Because of the time, perhaps if you could just take one of the questions, and that is, did you compare East Suffolk's scheme with that of any other LEA beside Cambridgeshire? Yes,
I did. And I compared it with Ipswich, and the differences are actually quite striking. In Ipswich, they built 2 high prestige new grammar schools, the Northgate schools. They had senior schools, but they operated under elementary regulations and were cheaper to build. They abolished the central school, which had provided good technical and commercial courses until that point, and they refused to replace it, despite pleas from local businesses and educators for a proper technical school or college. As you know, Ipswich didn't get one of those till 1961. I also looked briefly from secondary sources at Nottingham. They built senior schools to a good general standard, including science, arts and handicrafts and PE, gardening and domestic subjects, very similar. By 1933, they'd implemented the Haddo report pretty well in full. Now, Hertfordshire was another one that I looked at, and that was very different. What Hertfordshire did was it built a set of secondary, technical and senior elementary schools, 3 different types for each district. And the senior schools were new, light and spacious on greenfield sites with purpose-built laboratories, workshops and gymnasia. And they ran under secondary regulations, so pupils could stay till 16 and transfer between schools were easier. And they impressed all observers, including parents. So I think there were LEAs that did better than East Suffolk, but I think East Suffolk, bearing in mind what it was based on, the economic constraints it was under, the size of the authority, only half a county when you think about it, and even that's taking the biggest town out of it, I think it made an amazingly good job of what it did.